King Saul's encounter with the ghost of the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel 28 is unique in the Old Testament, and the questions it raises about the afterlife and the power of dark magic sit in tension with much of the Bible as well as the beliefs of modern Christians. In this video, we'll examine the story carefully and try to solve some of its puzzles. We'll also delve into the Old Testament's view of the afterlife, Israelite death cults, the ancient practice of necromancy, and the story's portrayal of the so-called Witch of Endor. This story takes place at the end of King Saul's reign. It begins with some brief exposition. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. Saul had expelled the spirits and the experts from the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of Yahweh, Yahweh did not answer him, not by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Samuel, of course, was the prophet who first anointed Saul as king, and then later anointed his rival David. The death of Samuel actually happened 3 chapters earlier, but now we are told something new. Saul has expelled the spirits and experts from his kingdom. These terms describe spirit diviners. The implication is that divination involving the spirits of the dead is no longer legal in Israel. Meanwhile, the Philistine army is camped at a place called Shunem, preparing to invade apparently. Saul's own army is camped at Gilboa. Saul is worried about the impending battle's outcome and tries to inquire of Yahweh what will happen. But the approved means of divination, dreams, the Urim, and prophets, all fail him. Now, the Urim were some kind of dice-like object, perhaps small painted stones or even sheep knuckle bones, that were used by priests for divination. The Bible calls this casting lots, and the technical term is Necromancy. However, King Saul has also slaughtered most of the priests, and the surviving high priest, Abiathar, has joined David's side, so the Urim are unavailable. And the prophet Samuel, of course, is dead. If Saul wants an answer, he'll have to resort to a less acceptable means of divination, the one he recently banned. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a spirit mistress, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." His servant said to him, "There is a spirit mistress at Endor." So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes and went there, he and 2 men with him. They came to the woman by night, and he said, "Conduct a seance for me, and bring up for me the one whom I name to you." The story takes a humorous turn. Although Saul has supposedly banned spirit divination, his servants know exactly where to find a diviner. They call her a Ba'alat Ob, which is typically translated as witch or medium, but the word Ob is a bit tricky. Professor A. Graeme Auld of the University of Edinburgh believes that it refers to a skin bottle, which he thinks could have been a prop used by mediums during seances, much like a crystal ball today. Others think it is related to the Hittite word api, which was an offering pit that was sometimes associated with the cult of the dead. Professor Christopher B. Hayes of Fuller Theological Seminary believes it is related to an Egyptian word, obat, which meant family or image and might have been used to describe one's dead ancestors in certain contexts. Whatever its origins, by the time we find this word in the Bible, it is taken on the metaphorical meaning of spirit of the dead. This woman then seems to be a diviner who can command the spirits of the dead. In other words, she is a necromancer. These verses raise other questions as well. Why does Saul insist on a female medium, and why does he visit at night? According to the late theologian Joseph Blenkinsop, this is because the story is a variation on a type scene. Essentially, it is a ghost story, and so it follows the conventions of such stories. There are no other tales like it in the Bible, but we'll consider some stories from other sources a little later on. Anyway, being a medium is a stereotypically female profession, so that's what Saul demands. Furthermore, spirit divination almost always takes place at night, as the ghost must apparently depart before dawn. Thus, Saul and his companions wait until after dark to visit. The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the spirits and the experts from the land." Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by Yahweh, "As Yahweh lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." As Anthony Campbell notes in his commentary on 1 Samuel, this story contains several puzzles related to identity and recognition. The first puzzle is this: how can Saul promise that the media won't be punished without revealing his identity as king? After all, Saul is wearing a disguise, and the woman won't discover his identity until verse 12. However, whatever the reason, swearing by Yahweh's name is enough to earn her trust. It should be noted that contrary to some commentators who think that the woman and the location of Endor should be understood as non-Israelite, the story makes it clear that she is part of the land of Israel, a believer in Yahweh, and one of the people affected by Saul's ban on necromancy. The location of Endor, by the way, is not known with certainty. Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He answered, "Bring up Samuel for me." And the woman saw Samuel, and she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Have no fear. What do you see?" The sequence of events described in these verses is confusing. 1. Saul names the person to be raised. 2. The woman sees Samuel. And 3. The woman realizes who Saul is. How could seeing Samuel possibly have made her recognize Saul? One scholar, Keith Bodner, remarks, "I find it utterly baffling how the woman perceives Samuel the prophet, and then immediately is able to identify Saul. It's also jarring that the woman sees Samuel the moment Saul speaks his name, 2 verses before the rising of Samuel actually takes place." Bible commentators have supplied many different explanations for these verses. Personally, I think the solution offered by Professor Esther Hamori of Union Theological Seminary makes the most sense. Repointing the verb saw turns it into feared, and this might have been the intended meaning. It is misspelled, but the same misspelling appears earlier in verse 5. By this understanding, the sequence is as follows. 1. Saul tells the woman it is Samuel he wants to raise. 2. The woman is afraid of Samuel and gives a cry of dismay. 3. She tells Saul that she has seen through his disguise. It may be that she has known all along who he was. 4. Saul tells her not to be afraid, of Samuel that is. 5. Then the medium performs the ritual, of which the author omits any detail. On this point, Hamori suggests that he might not have even known how such rituals were conducted. And now, the ghost of Samuel enters the scene. The woman said to Saul, "I see gods coming up out of the ground." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" She said, "An old man is coming up. He is wrapped in a robe." So Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did obeisance. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have summoned you to tell me what I should do." What many commentators fail to notice about this seance is that Saul cannot see Samuel, he can only hear him. He relies on the medium to tell him what she sees. This is interesting because it raises the question of how much the author knew about necromancy. Real-life seances are always fake, of course, so ventriloquism is a useful tool for a successful medium. The medium's customer gets to hear a voice they think is the spirit of the dead, but they have to trust the medium regarding what he or she claims to see. In fact, the Septuagint translation of 1 Samuel expressly calls the medium a ventriloquist, or one who speaks from the belly. So our author seems to know enough about seances to know they are an audio-only experience, but he still treats the practice of necromancy as genuine. Getting back to the story, what it means for the medium to see gods coming up out of the ground is debated by scholars. The Hebrew word Elohim, or gods, could sometimes refer to dead spirits, but it might also describe chthonic guardian deities in this context. And naturally, they come up out of the ground, since the Israelites believed that the Netherworld was a physical location beneath the earth. Next, the medium tells Saul she sees an old man in a robe. Amusingly, this bare-bones description is enough to convince Saul of the ghost's identity. It would seem that spirits are stuck for eternity with the same clothing they were wearing when they died. And are there, no other robe-wearing old men in the underworld? We'll actually come back to this question in a bit. Samuel's dismay at being disturbed seems to be an element of the ghost story trope. The conversation that ensues between Saul and Samuel confirms that we are dealing with the real Samuel. He knows intimate details about Saul's life and the fact that Saul will soon die. The medium would not have known such things. At this point, we need to examine what the biblical authors and, more generally, ancient Israelites believed about death and the afterlife. References to death in the Old Testament generally agree with the views preserved in the literature of Bronze Age Ugarit, who were a cultural predecessor to the Israelites, as well as the texts and inscriptions of ancient Phoenicia, Ebla, Aram, and Canaan. These cultures believed that the spirits of all deceased went down to the Netherworld, called Sheol in Hebrew. It was not an afterlife in which the dead could experience the passage of time and have new experiences, but a dark and silent existence from which there was no return. This is not the celestial afterlife that later Jews and Christians came to believe in, but it is consistent with our story here, with Samuel rising from his slumber beneath the earth, unhappy at being disturbed. There is also strong evidence for a widespread cult of the dead among the Israelites. The Old Testament often speaks of household idols called teraphim that apparently represented the spirits of ancestors. There is the story of Rachel who steals her father's teraphim in Genesis 31, and the story of Saul's daughter Michal, who puts one under the blankets to fool Saul's men into thinking David is sick in bed. There's also the tale of Micah's teraphim, which is stolen by the Danites in Judges 18. The existence of teraphim in Israelite households is taken for granted, and none of these stories condemn the teraphim themselves, nor the rituals connected with them. According to an exhaustive study of burial practices in ancient Israel by Elizabeth Block Smith, Judahites in particular had elaborate mortuary practices, with rituals that included offerings of food and drink for the deceased. This practice is acknowledged by Deuteronomy 26:14, which forbids the same food being offered both to the dead and then to Yahweh. The act of feeding the dead is not itself banned. Judahite tombs also contained a variety of figurines, the most common of which was a female idol known as a pillar figurine. Its purpose is debated, but according to Block Smith, these figurines were thought to protect the health and fertility of childbearing family members by accessing the power of dead ancestors through sympathetic magic. The Bible also preserves the belief that a dead spirit's power could be accessed through its corpse or tomb. In 2 Kings 13, contact with Elisha's bones is sufficient to bring a dead man back to life, and the ability of dead spirits to exact revenge might explain why David has the hands and feet cut off the corpses of Ishbaal's murderers in 2 Samuel 4. Additionally, the Bible occasionally refers to netherworld beings called Rephaim, which are known from the Ugaritic literature as well. They seem to be the dead spirits of former kings and great warriors who inhabit the netherworld. For example, Isaiah 14:9 describes the Rephaim as spirits of dead kings who greet the king of Babylon upon his own death. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the Rephaim to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. And Psalm 88 asks ironically of Yahweh, "Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the Rephaim rise up to praise you?" It's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. So we know from both archaeology and the Bible itself that ancient Judahites believed that the dead who inhabited Sheol could sometimes influence the world of the living. However, this belief does not equate to necromancy, and the extent to which the spirits of the dead were invoked for divination is unclear. The Endor story and the prohibition of necromancy in Leviticus imply that it was a widespread practice, but these texts reached their current forms after the Babylonian exile and might not reflect Israelite society centuries earlier. Archaeological evidence is also elusive. The Ugaritic texts do not describe any necromantic rituals, and although a small number of Assyrian texts describe a ritual in which a human skull is used to invoke the dead, this ritual's nature is debated. In several recent papers, Old Testament professor Klaus-Peter argues that the ritual's purpose was exorcism rather than divination, and that necromancy was rare in the ancient Near East, if it was practiced at all. The Neo-Assyrian sources suggested to deal with necromancy are in fact apotropaic ritual texts that do not cite a direct dialogue between the deceased persona's ghost and the necromancer. If Adam's view is correct, then we should consider other sources as the background for 1 Samuel 28. One of the most remarkable aspects of the story is the fact that Saul has a full-blown conversation with the ghost of Samuel. This has no parallel in the Bible or in other Mesopotamian literature, leading some scholars, including Klaus-Peter Adam and Bruce Loudon, to propose that the story is influenced by a genre of Greek story called the Nekia, which is related to the word necromancy. The most famous Nekia is found in Homer's Odyssey. It concerns King Odysseus and the enchantress Circe, who instructs Odysseus in a ritual so that he can consult with the spirit of the seer Tiresias to obtain information he needs. Other similarities noted by Adam include the necromancer being a woman, the ghost's reproach of the inquirer, the prediction of the decline of a dynasty or king, the use of disguise, fasting, and a nocturnal setting. Bruce Loudon further notes that Samuel and Tiresias share several thematic parallels, such as each having an article that allows the inquirer to recognize them, Samuel's cloak and Tiresias' staff. This might help to explain why it is necessary for Saul to recognize Samuel from the description of his cloak. Another close parallel to the Endor story is found in The Persians, a Greek tragedy written in 472 BCE by Aeschylus. In this play, the Queen Mother Atossa is concerned about the fate of her son Xerxes in his upcoming war with Greece, so she invokes the ghost of the deceased King Darius and has a long discussion with him in which he foretells the defeat of the Persians. In his thorough survey of the parallels, Adam concludes that the oral tradition of Greek poetry, including Homer and Aeschylus, had an enormous impact in the transmission of necromancy from Greek culture to the biblical authors of 1 Samuel 28. After his conversation with the ghost, Saul collapses on the floor, utterly sapped of strength. The woman is filled with compassion and insists on preparing a hearty meal for Saul and his servants before they head off into the night. Modern readers may be inclined to view the ghost mistress of Endor, usually uncharitably called a witch, as a practitioner of evil arts and a witting participant in Saul's crimes. It is sometimes assumed she must be a foreigner since no true Israelite would dabble in witchcraft. Such views do not find support in the biblical text, however. As Graeme Auld notes, despite warnings about her sort elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, this unnamed medium from Endor is presented very sympathetically. She is an engaging character offering hospitality to the king about to die, readily killing an animal of her own to feed an unexpected visitor. Contrary perhaps to what many modern readers think, the story is not really about necromancy, and it does not explicitly condemn Saul for resorting to such measures, nor the medium for carrying them out. Rather, it continues a theme found elsewhere in the saga of Saul's reign, that he has lost Yahweh's favor and can no longer obtain guidance from his own deity, even though his rival David does so with ease. The visit to the necromancer adds dramatic irony, as Saul is forced to resort to measures he himself has outlawed. Only the lowly medium, an outcast of mainstream society due to Saul's own actions, can help Saul hear from Yahweh, and in the end, we see him a broken and powerless man.
I gathered the people of Israel to me and protected them. They are my children.
You have failed them.